Diziki Kunazikia Kakiatkata stood on the embarkation deck and watched as the small shuttle lifted off. Inside the windows he could see Tyrrhenican beaks and faces looking back at him. Their bodies were poised in stances of sadness that he couldn't see, but he could see their eyes, especially Xia. As they watched, he turned and walked back towards the door, not turning his head to see them. The soft robes over the rough quills of new plumage was a constant reminder to him of everything he had gone through since coming here. He couldn't help but think he should be back on that shuttle leaving now, but he wouldn't be able to live with himself. He didn't know how he had lived with himself and the things he had done for so long in the first place. Xia in particular had all but begged him to leave, but he wouldn't budge. Instead, he had done what so many humans and Chua had done on this ship, and recorded a final message, which the shuttle would bring back with the rest of his team to the conclave. Since the Vral had started their transmissions, not a single thing had gotten through. The word that Fleet Marshal Simmons had given the Tyrrhenican delegation a shuttle to leave the fleet and head back home had come as yet another welcome surprise. Another thing he didn't expect out of them, much less Simmons herself. The first time he had met her, she had turned from friendly to the visage of a wrathful goddess. The exposed backroom dealings between himself and the Vral Empire, the way the humans had changed from so many galactic cycles on the brink of being conquered, and the revelation of how Toombs actually viewed his people and their willingness to allow the horrors the Vral had committed had changed him. Only months prior, he had carried himself with almost an aura of invincibility. He had been the chief ambassador of the Tyrrhenican Conclave, the strongest nation-state in the entire quadrant of the galaxy. His people were noble, his people were just. How much of a fool he had been, even to himself. Now he stood on a ship the likes of which could obliterate empires, which itself was destined to be destroyed by the very species he had sold the humans who had built this ship out to. He had discovered far too late that the Vral's power far outstriped his own people's strength. He had been concerned that the humans, after they had finished with the Vral, would invade Tyrrhenican space. Now that was a moot point. The Vral had been hiding their true strength. His own people were wrapped in a civil war over the enslavement they had been a part of the humans and other species the Vral had sold them, and the humans were making what could only be considered a desperate last stand in this system to wound the Vral enough so that their fleet wouldn't simply move past Thermopylae station on its way to Earth itself. He had seen Thermopylae, the hideous scar in space that had kept the Vral's invasion forces back for nearly 100 years, been inside of it. Back then, he had thought it was a hideous scar in space, but now he realized why the humans had considered it beautiful. None of that mattered now. The second that Chikanamori declared war on the Vral alongside the 3 other elder species, the Vral knew their time was done, and they were done hiding. Tika knew one thing better than most would ever understand. The Vral hated the humans, hated them for the crime of simply still existing. Now they had a much better reason since the Terran front had invaded and shown the entire galaxy the Vral's dirty laundry. Now the Vral were on borrowed time, and instead of using that time to fortify their core worlds, they were lashing out one last time at the species that dared to resist them. Tika stared down the hallway he was in, watching humans and Chua moving along slowly. Subdued, ready, they barely looked at him aside from the occasional glance. All of them were bracing for what was to come. A good many of them were wearing sidearms on their uniforms, pistols in holsters. Tika knew that by the time the Vral appeared on the edge of the system, most of the crew would be armed. They were preparing to be boarded on the Antares. The thought of that to him was horrifying. Fighting a Vral in close quarters like these for a Tyrrhenican was a frightening prospect. Tika could only ruffle his quills with a bit of dark humor. Even worse than fighting one of the Vral would be to fight a human. Humans were stronger, faster, had better hand-eye coordination, and had endurance that seemed supernatural. The only way a Vral could stand up to most humans physically was in a war suit. If the Vral Empire wanted to take the Antares by force, they'd bleed for it. They were already going to bleed fighting the fleet itself, even if every projection saw the Vral winning in the end. Tika hoped it wouldn't come to a boarding action. His head looked up at one of the speaker panels as a chime sounded. Now hear this. Watch groups S and T report to your section armory. He saw a few glance up at the speaker, notably those who weren't currently carrying sidearms. Some of them turned and began heading in one direction. He didn't follow. He might have been curious at one point to see how the humans went about arming themselves, if they had any rituals like his people did. Not anymore. As he tapped the panel to his diplomatic quarters, which was really just a set of crew quarters with a fancy name, the door slid open and he stepped inside. He turned off the lights. Turnicans had a natural fear of the dark that was almost crippling. His species evolved on a world where when the sun went down, the predators came out. Sounds in the night meant the options for survival had ran out. He plunged himself into darkness, something that would have caused him months ago to panic, slapping at the wall, desperate to find the panel to turn back on the comforting light. A dozen, then 100 different monsters came out of the dark at him, but he didn't flinch. He didn't go into hysterics. His hearts didn't change their beatings. Tika stood in the darkness and silence, and every so often the faint sound of something in the ship would make a noise, but he wasn't afraid anymore. He took a step away from the wall and stood alone in the pitch black. Unbidden, Simmons came to his mind, her body backlit by flashes from the darkness of the hyperspace lane they had been traveling through when he had first been plunged into the darkness on this ship. The humans called it combat lighting. They could see the red spectrum of light, and Tyrannicans couldn't. He thought about what he had done with abject shame. He had screamed, flailed, soiled himself on the floor and fallen in it. Simmons had stood over him like a wrathful god, and Tika had called her a monster. He had called her a monster. Now Tika stood in the dark, unafraid, staring into the nothing. There were no monsters in the dark except him. He heard a tone over his head and didn't flinch like he might have months ago. Now hear this. 2 hours until expected engagement. Tika stood in the dark. 2 hours left. He stood in the dark. He wasn't afraid. He had changed so much, so drastically, in such a short amount of time. For a moment he thought about his home. His quills rustled in amusement as a rather silly thought occurred to him. He hoped that they would care for his plants. Then again, he knew that by now they were probably dead already. This mission was only supposed to last a week at most, after all. At the edge of the system, Xia and the rest of the Turnican delegation were huddled together as they prepared to jump to the next system. Xia was playing out Tizikakuna Zakiakakiatkata's message. From what the Chua had told them as they left, the Vral were drowning out comm signals for at least 10 light-years in all directions. They were heading back to Turinican space, but it would be at least 2 jumps before they were in a position to even fight through the interference. She heard the technician give a countdown, then the shuttle entered the hyperspace lane, the stars streaking, then the entire panel went dark as the void. All the Tyrannicans felt their souls shrivel back from the dark as they looked out into it, the primal fear of the dark making them bristle. Xia distracted herself by looking down at Tika as he spoke on her data slate. Most likely best-case scenario is that the human homeworld will be subjected to prolonged small craft attack. They are hoping to destroy or cripple as many capital ships as possible. In any case, my final wishes are that our people welcome the Terran Front as a protectorate state and assist them in rebuilding efforts, and we return their citizens to them as I have stated before. Xia slowly rustled her feathers, craning her neck. She admired Tika for staying in more ways than one. On the screen, Tika was continuing to speak, mainly about how the humans should be treated, about avoiding the mistakes of the past, about atonement. She simply listened. After a while, she turned off the recording and let herself drift in thought. She should feel something, anything. She was finally off of the Antares, heading back home, away from what to most of her people would be a horrific nightmare. She couldn't feel anything right now. Judging by the body posture of the rest of those around her, she could tell they were feeling the same thing she was. She'd be back in Turinican space in 2 days. Their path would take them along the edge of Vral space, away from the fleet bearing down on the Terrans. She'd be back in the capital in a few more days if they didn't stop for a debrief before that. She wanted to go back to her own home, sit in her own roost, feel the comforts she had long been denied from living on a human ship. Not that they hadn't been shockingly accommodating once the initial terror had subsided, but there was no place like home. She heard a countdown, the countdown to the exit point from the hyperspace lane, and she waited for the welcome sight of stars again. As the viewport turned a brilliant gray, the screen narrowing to streaks, then individual stars, she breathed out. "Contact," the navigator trilled. Kezia felt her plumage raise in alarm. "Signals coming in. Closing." "Contact? Here?" The grim voice of the navigator trilled through his beak, his voice carrying a tremor that Kezia felt in her hollow bones. "Ambush." Simmons listened to the noise over the comms. A lone drone cutter out near the Mandeville Point reporting on the fleet that was coming. They knew she was waiting for them. They weren't even bothering to shoot the drone in the next system. She was thankful that whoever was piloting the drone was professional enough not to let dread crawl into their voice. The fleet of the Antares was spread out in a battle line. Swarms of fighters and strike craft billowed in clouds around the larger ships. Cruisers and destroyers hovered in picket lines, while the small lights of Corvette engines seemed to be a massive swarm of angry hornets. The fleet she had at her disposal was large, but it was nothing compared to what was about to jump into them. "Recall the cutter," she said, and only a moment later she heard the calls for radiation blooms from craft incoming to system via hyperspace lane. She didn't need to know how many. She keyed up a small transmitter in her hands and nodded to Hazard. "Crew of the Antares, cease operations and listen close." The chatter stopped. As she knew throughout the ship, thousands of heads were listening to her every word. On every ship in the fleet, captains and commanders are giving a speech much like I'm giving right now. She glanced up at the readout display on the small panel in front of her, seeing the timer ticking down quickly. "We set out from Thermopylae to do one thing and one thing alone. To take back our pride, to take back our lives, from those who had reveled in taking it from us." She paused for only a breath. "And we did more than that," she whispered into the transmitter. "We tore them down to the bare bones, forced them to show their hand. In doing that, we did more than just win a war, more than just win a battle. As of today, I declare total victory against the Vral." She called out, her voice ringing with vindictive pride. "Today we sacrifice ourselves as countless generations have before us for one reason, to earn the right for our people to live. Stand to your duties, leave no missile in its housing, leave no shell unfired." Simmons glanced back, seeing the harsh, determined features of her staff, the others looking at her, small Chua faces mixed with human. She looked back to the stars where soon the Vral would emerge in all their horrible quantity. "Today may be our end, but it is also theirs. Their empire will die, while the Terran front will endure. Now, as we have for a century, use every weapon we have. Guns, missiles, pistols, fists, down to our teeth. Take from them until you can take no longer. There is nothing for them here, except death." She looked over her shoulder, unkeying the transmitter as she locked eyes with an admiral, nodding once. The admiral turned to a panel and began to rapidly key in a sequence into his panel. "The time has come," she said with finality in her tone. "Make sure that history always remembers the name Antares." She let the transmitter fall, then she turned back to the table. "Worst speech I've ever done," she muttered as she walked up to the table and stared down at the tactical map. She glanced to the side at the Myrmidon agent dressed in his exosuit who had come to the bridge about 30 minutes ago. She pressed her hands against the table, then she glanced around it at the waiting faces. Slowly she grinned at them, a predatory grin. The admirals, captains, and commanders looking at her began to reflect her expression. "Well, everyone, it's been an honor serving with you all. Let's roll out the red carpet for our guests, shall we?" Heads nodded in assent. "Commence welcome wagon." The uniforms at the table suddenly all turned as if they had coordinated the move, walking and in some cases running to their stations and communications hubs, save for one. He keyed up a transmitter as he put on a headset. "All stations, welcome wagon is go, all stations. Welcome wagon is go. Commence in 30 seconds on my mark," he said. Then his eyes turned up to the countdown timer showing when the Vral fleet would emerge into real space. When the timer hit 35 seconds, he barked out, "Mark." Simmons could almost feel the ship charging, preparing. She flipped her panel to display the incoming radiation signals, seeing the entire area of space in front of her practically glowing with the amount of ships that were on the way to them. The system itself was flicking error messages, but her predatory grin was not going away. Time to find out how good those flash dimmers really are, she said, almost to herself. She glanced at the countdown, then silently counted down in her head as she turned back to the viewport, looking out at the stars. Commence. She heard the officer behind her state. Her smile broadened as she almost could hear the fleet bellowing out its welcome. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of small drive plumes blossoming to life from every cruiser and battleship in the fleet. A halo of drive plumes silently arched from the capital battle line of the Terran Front's fleet towards the expanse of empty space. Seconds later, in pods scattered across the entire battle line, thousands of launchers came active, their payloads screaming silently out of their containers. All of them arched towards the Mandeville point. 7 contacts, she heard the officer say behind her, and just as soon as she heard him say it, she watched as the 7 contacts blossomed into small stars. The Vral were slow learners, but they had picked up this trick a long time ago. The corvettes they would send through first would overload their drives instantly to start a chain reaction of mine detonations. After falling for the same tactic over and over again, they had started doing this any time they came to Thermopylae. Tired of losing fleets to mine fields that were laying in wait, she had had no doubt they would do so again. The 7 Vral corvettes exploded, detonating nothing but themselves, sacrificing themselves for nothing. Vral fleet arriving in 5, the officer said behind her. Simmons glared at the window out to the stars, her breathing hitched and almost snarling through the very smile on her face as suddenly her entire field of view was polluted with the sight of thousands upon thousands of Vral ships, the number growing larger and larger as they continued to arrive in system, tightly packed from the transit tunnel. The sight of it was absolutely staggering, the fleet more massive than even she had prepared herself mentally to see. No, it was worse than that. What she was seeing she absolutely couldn't believe. Her jaw slackened for just a moment before the realization hit her and her smile came back and turned feral. Almost without thought, she threw her hand up in front of her eyes. The screen went almost black as the light of 100 suns going supernova radiated out. In a flash that primitive cultures would consider the birth of a new god, a flash that thousands of years later could be seen from the homeworld of the Chikanomori. Thousands of missiles armed with Vortex Apocalypse warheads detonated on the leading edge of the Vral fleet. In an instant, ships that would classify as armadas in their own right were reduced to superheated slag, thrown back by the shock wave of the explosion into others, in most cases completely overloading the shields of those ships to coat the vessel in superheated alloy and plasma. Larger hulls caught in the blast were torn completely apart, pieces of the flying back at fractions of the speed of light, tearing gaping wounds in larger hulls, completely destroying smaller ones. The transmission the Vral had been pumping on all channels was cut off almost instantaneously. The view screen began to become transparent again as the light of that many weapons of mass destruction rapidly faded, replaced with the fierce orange glow of melted hulls. It wasn't enough. It wasn't going to kill all of them. It wasn't going to kill nearly enough of them. It didn't stop Simmons from laughing as she looked to Hazard, who nodded at her. She slammed her finger down on the transmitter, Hazard broadcasting her words to the entire fleet, her command protocol overriding the block on the intra-ship communications. All ships, fire at will. She saw the Vral start to spread out, some of them desperately trying to push through the wreckage of their comrades, bringing themselves to ruin in the process. She watched as a lone Vral battleship, half of its hull covered in the molten slag of its less fortunate kin, pushed out of the miasma only to be met with railgun rounds which carved through the hot alloy like a blade through butter. Its drive detonated, the hull blossoming open, throwing a fragment of its own hull like a spear straight through a cruiser who had been using the battleship's bulk to try and gain some room to maneuver. The cruiser itself suddenly bucked as one of Antari's own mass driver rounds punched savagely through its spine. "Kill them!" she roared, her voice heard on every ship, every corvette, every destroyer, cruiser, and battleship, every support tender, every strike fighter and bomber under her command. "Kill them all!" The Terran Front's entire fleet surged forward, save for the battle line of battleships and cruisers. More and more Vral ships arrived, and despite the expanse of space with the sheer quantity of ships that were arriving, they found themselves packed together tightly, almost trapped with, in some cases, barely any room to maneuver. The Terran fleet seized the only advantage it had, the only advantage it was going to have, and turned the Mandeville Point into a kill box, using the size and weight of the Vral fleet against it. As Simmons turned back to the table, she saw that most of the commanders who had spread out were now back in place. She was silent now, looking over the tactical map and staring at it as the fleet commanders took control of their sections of the battle line. Despite the utter rain of death, they were pouring into that singular point in space. Vral ships were already breaking out. The battle line was spreading. So far, she had nothing to say, no orders to give. The battle plan was going as well as it could possibly go. 7th Fleet and 5th Fleet were stationed on opposite ends of her battle line, and even as she watched, she could see the only signals getting too far were smaller ones. Any cruiser or battleship that started to break out was met with combined fire. It was hard to even concentrate on the amount of signals on the main tactical map right now, and the number was growing. Soon this would devolve into a brawl she had no hope of winning, but the Vral had to break out of the prison they had put themselves in first. She watched the signals as the leading edge of the strike craft waves dived into the mass of Vral ships, their targets the drive seconds of the cruisers and battleships. The longer she could keep them clogged up, the longer she could keep them from getting space to move, the more pain she could direct and inflict before the battle became too chaotic to control. She watched the signals from the corvette wings diving onto the mass of Vral hulls, a small grin on her face. She felt the presence of the Myrmidon nearby, and she glanced over her shoulder at him, making a movement of her head to get him to come closer. As he stepped to her side, she motioned to the signals, showing like nothing more than a swarm of blues attacking a red cloud. Seven said nothing, even though he had no idea what he was really seeing. "Admiral Zedak, are we ready for Phase 2? She asked, looking up at the Admiral, a small gray Chua who stood on a plinth at the far end of the table. Seven had never seen a Chua smile, but he could swear that Admiral Zedak was wearing the most sinister grin he had ever witnessed. The Chua slowly mimicked a human nod. "Good." Simmons glanced to Seven. "You're going to like this one. Welcome Wagon Phase 2 begin. Silent countdown." The Chua chirped into a transmitter. Simmons and Seven stared at the screen. Simmons' head turned down as a small red icon appeared at the bottom left of the table. A tiny chevron, marking the class of ship as a corvette. Aswang was the name beside it. She stared at the name. It was the name of a myth from a country called the Philippines of a vampire-like creature, Dot. It was also the first ship she had lost in this fight. She should feel unbelievably happy about that considering the catastrophic damage her fleet had already done. But she didn't. 12 people had just died and more would die today. 2 more symbols appeared on the screen. Corvettes, El Nadaha and Drekavac. She yanked her head from the small casualty feed and glanced up at the symbols. Out between her battle line and the Vral fleet that was still struggling to come into system, a second line of scatterpack missile launchers began belching their payloads into the void. On the display, every corvette, strike wing, and destroyer suddenly turned and burned away from the Vral. Icons appeared on the map, showing the second salvo, the last salvo, of Apocalypse Vortex missiles rapidly closed in on the Vral fleet. "Keep them continued for as long as we can. Keep the choked up for as long as we can." She remembered her own briefing she had given to the fleet commanders as the missiles streaked across the endless void. Tracer fire from point defense systems on the Vral ships that they hadn't had time to activate on the first salvo, desperately trying to shoot the missiles down. She saw 2 of the icons blink out from the missiles transponders, then 3. But it was like trying to shoot a swarm. The Vral fleet in system was almost helpless, pinned down by its own weight. As its doom approached, even as more of their ships arrived in system. "Hurt them as much as we can," Simmons thought to herself as the missiles entered their terminal phase. Almost all of her own ships clear at this point of the blast radius. "Until they overwhelm us."